Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Ben Powell, professor of economics at Texas Tech and author of Out of Poverty, Sweatshops of the Global Economy. Ben, welcome to the show.
Bill, thanks. Great to be with you.
Ben, you've enraged many people by fashioning yourself as a champion of so-called sweatshops. How could you defend low wages and poor working conditions? Doesn't every fellow human being deserve the kind of job and income enjoyed by the average American professor?
Sure. I think we should aspire to a world where everybody does enjoy a standard of living, heck, better than your average American professor. But wishing doesn't make it so. So my work on sweatshops in some sense has been characterized as a defense of these sweatshops, but it's a particular type. It's not a type of defense that puts profits over people or that just says it's efficient to have this and I'm an economist and we care about economic efficiency, or one that says it's good for us as consumers. It's a means-ends defense. It's a defense that says if we care about the welfare of third world workers and, for that matter, potential workers, much of what the anti-sweatshop movement agitates for would make these very people worse off rather than better off. Instead, other things should be done if we care about improving their lives.
Well, you've just defined communism, right? I mean, we'd love to make people all better off, but most of what they've done seems to have gone in the opposite direction.
That's certainly true. Free markets have brought us much more prosperity than the death and destruction that socialism brought us in the 20th century.
Start us off, if you would, providing a view from the other side. If you were told to make a passionate but rational criticism of sweatshops, how would you do it?
Well, I think you can make criticisms of them that appeal to people's emotions and strike a chord with people that these working conditions are just horrible and that they have very low pay by our standards. And all of these things are true, but it doesn't deliver the goods in terms of the better life. When people advocate for things like a living wage for them or improved safety standards that must be enforced, or just enforcing whatever labor laws happen to exist, or eliminating child labor by banning the products, I think all of these things, and I'd be happy to explain any of them, would make the workers worse off.
Let's take that from the top. Why can't we just insist that manufacturers who run these sweatshops pay their workers 20% more?
So often people will say, these workers, they make so little, it's a small amount of the total cost of the garment. Why can't we just mandate higher pay? Well, there's two things we have to understand about wage determination. The upper bound, the most an employer is willing to pay, is the productivity of that labor, how much it contributes to the firm's revenue. Lower bound is whatever that worker's next best alternative is. If we're going to raise wages, it has to be about moving these two bounds upward. And in practice, the lion's share of the gains come from making the worker more productive rather than increasing the other opportunities. But both are part of it. Enforcing a minimum wage doesn't change these bounds. It just outlaws some workers from working who don't have the productivity to justify that pay. If these sweatshops are profit maximizing, which I have no reason to believe that the greedy capitalists running these things aren't trying to maximize their profits, they're already employing laborers right up to the point where the last one is barely worth employing. That means if we mandate higher wages, some workers might be a little bit better off, but others are going to be thrown into worse alternatives. Sometimes these alternatives are much worse. And it will also shift employment from very poor countries like Bangladesh to more productive countries like in Latin America or even on the margin back to the United States and Western Europe.
Ben, let's zero in particularly on Bangladesh. It keeps coming back in the news, particularly when there's a factory collapse and so many poor people are hurt. What are the economic conditions there now?
Bangladesh is desperately poor, and when we see a factory collapse, obviously the workers who were in there did not benefit from that employment after the fact. When, 1,000 died in Rana Plaza, that clearly was not their best alternative, as revealed after the fact.
It's horrible.
But for the 4 million people, not 1,000, but 4 million people who work in the garment industry in Bangladesh, this often lives them up above the $2 a day threshold, which doesn't sound like much to us, but over the time period that sweatshops have been reported in Bangladesh, upwards of 85% of the population was living on less than $2 a day. So these jobs are risky, but the workers feel that they're worth the risk going into it. And of course, some people, when a factory collapses, end up worse off, but that's no different than when a fire in your house in the United States kills a family. It doesn't prove that housing is bad for the rest of us and we should go back to dwelling in caves. But if we mandated higher safety standards for Bangladesh, it would raise the cost of labor in Bangladesh and encourage companies then to leave Bangladesh and go to places where workers might be more expensive, but they're also more productive, which can justify the higher labor cost.
From a moral and environmental perspective, isn't living in rural harmony close to the land preferable to moving to a big city to work in a factory?
Well, the evidence is that people choose to leave those fields and come work in the city, in the factory, just like they did in our country in the 19th century, because the pay and often even the working conditions are better in the factories than they are if you're on a subsistence farm and tilling the field with grandpa's femur. That's your relevant alternative, which is the abject poverty that is the situation for many workers around the world who are in rural areas. Life in the factory is a step up. It's like the first rung on the economic ladder of development.
Can't foreign aid solve the abject poverty problem better than having them work in sweatshops?
Foreign aid's been an abysmal failure at solving the abject poverty problem for the 70 years that it's been in existence post-World War II. Aid, whether it's for investment, for education, or any of the major programs the World Bank has tried, has been abysmal at actually creating long-term sustained development.
Who's behind the anti-sweatshop movement? It keeps breaking into the news on a cyclical basis.
Well, it's a curious mix of people who are involved in the anti-sweatshop movement, including student groups, various celebrities and activists, but a large part of it's related to labor unions, which is no accident. AFL-CIO are involved, Unite, the garment workers union in the United States. A union's job, as far as I know, is to raise the wages and working conditions of its members. But these poor workers toiling in sweatshops are not members of these unions.
They're competitors.
They're competitors. The unions would have you believe they do this out of, some sort of workers of the world unite type sentiment, but it's entirely the opposite. What they're doing is they're trying to price their competition, low cost, low productivity third world labor, out of the market to enhance the demand for first world high productivity workers who are union members.
Ben, Americans are very compassionate people. Wouldn't most shoppers gladly pay 20% more for consumer goods produced in sweatshops if they knew the money would go to help the needy?
Well, I think that's a valuable point as a business strategy. If it is true, then businesses can benefit by advertising that they pay a little bit more to their workers and sell their products for a little bit more here. Some sort of ethical branding like what you see in fair trade coffee.
Right.
So there's nothing anti-market process or necessarily means ends incompatible about doing this. But what I've seen is there's a lot of fraud in this, whether it's the fair trade coffee or the ethical branding here, because you can satisfy the requirements while actually making the poorest of the poor worse off. So say you want to guarantee some minimum wage, but the workers in Bangladesh aren't productive enough to justify that wage. Well, move your factory from Bangladesh to Honduras where the workers are more productive, pay a little bit more, advertise that. People in the West feel good about the product, but really what you did was you left the poorest of the poor and went to the relatively medium poor. And some of them, there's one thing called Shop with a Conscience Consumer Guide. It's a complete fraud. It guarantees that all of the products sold on their website are sweat-free, that has labor that earns a living wage, has good working conditions, the right to organize. So you might buy from there thinking you're helping the poor around the world. Bogus. You look at a map of where their factories are located, and the vast majority of them are in the United States and Canada. What you're doing is a Buy in the USA campaign in disguise in the name of third world workers.
Ben, you've described how setting minimum wages can put people out of work in desperately poor countries. What about setting minimum prices here? What about passing a law that says Walmart can't sell an undershirt for less than $14?
Yeah, no, what that's going to result in is fewer undershirts being sold in the United States and less demand for the labor in these poorer countries that makes those undershirts, throwing them into some of these worse alternatives. We haven't spoke about that, but we need to put this in perspective because people hear a low wage in a third world country and they compare it to what we have here. What we need to compare it to is what are the relevant alternatives for the workers in that country? So let me tell you a quick story. This is a famous anti-sweatshop case. Wendy Diaz, a Honduran sweatshop worker, was brought by Charlie Kiernan onto a television show in the United States to confront Kathy Lee Gifford.
Oh, I remember that.
She was a 15-year-old girl stitching Kathy Lee Gifford garments. And he brought her on TV and said, this poor girl's making 31 cents an hour in your factory, you're exploiting her. Kathy Lee cried on television, apologized, said she'd change her ways. But all of us were comparing the 31 cents an hour that she was getting there to U.S. wages. But in fact, her earnings translated into about $950 a year or about $2.75 per day. But back in 1996, when she came on television, more than 15% of the Hondurans lived on less than $1 a day, and nearly a third of them lived on less than $2 a day. In fact, this 15-year-old girl was earning 37% above national average. If we do things to jeopardize jobs for the Wendy Diaz's there, it's not to give them a better alternative like a U.S. job. No one's offering these people a visa, although I think maybe they should. The relevant alternative is the much poorer jobs that exist everywhere all around them.
Ben, when people talk about sweatshops, Walmart's name often comes up. What role has Walmart played in harming the poor, both in developing countries and here in the U.S.?
Walmart is a great anti-poverty program. So here in the United States, their innovations of their supply chain and how they deliver products has lowered prices for people across the United States, and that's disproportionately benefited poorer people who spend a higher fraction of their income on the goods that are served at Walmart. For the poor around the world, Walmart doesn't directly employ them. Most sweatshop garments are made by domestic subcontractors who sell to various multinationals. But the demands by Walmart for goods from the third world creates the employment that allows these sweatshops to operate and give these workers a step up compared to the scavenging and begging, the working in the subsistence farm, and the other poor alternatives that these workers had prior to getting contracts to export to the United States.
If Walmart really is such a great boon to the poor, why does it have such a bad rap?
It doesn't have such a bad rap among the poor. The poor who shop there have a smiling face. The elitists who live in wealthy cities and want to exclude Walmart from coming in are the ones who it has a bad rap with. Don't get me wrong. I don't really like shopping in Walmart myself, but that doesn't mean that I can't recognize the valuable service it provides for everybody.
So the U.S. went through a sweatshop phase in its economic history. I know because my grandparents immigrated here to work in them. How were those immigrants harmed?
They weren't. So my ancestors worked in them too. In fact, I grew up in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and did my undergraduate degree in the heart of the Industrial Revolution in the United States in Lowell, Massachusetts. So I grew up around these factories that would be classified as sweatshops if they were operating today. But much like third world workers now, the workers in the United States were leaving the farms for better opportunities in the factory. Initially, this was a lot of women in New England leaving the farm and earning money in the factories, where often after a year or two in the factories, they'd go home and have more money saved than their parents did. And then later, those women were replaced with immigrants who were leaving literally starvation in Ireland when they come to the United States and start filling the factory jobs. So just like the third world today, it was a step up. But I think an important thing for us to realize is that this process of development, as we accumulate more capital, more technology, our productivity goes up, and then wages and working conditions follow. In the United States, that's about a 100-year time period from pre-industrial to something that looks like post-sweatshop. But if we think, who were the sweatshop countries circa 1960? The list is Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South
look at
Korea.
them now.
All of these in a generation jumped from pre-industrial. I mean, Taiwan at that time, your average per capita income circa the 1950s is somewhere on the order of $500 per capita. They're pre-industrial. And then a generation later, they're at first world standards. The process can happen so much more quickly today because there's so much more technology and capital out there in the world that as you get your institutions right, and by that I mean something that respects economic freedom, the rule of law, and has secure property rights, the investment in technology flows in. You can't skip the stage of sweatshop development, but you can move through it much more quickly. Even the United States moved through it more quickly than Great Britain because we were stealing the technology from Great Britain and, for that matter, getting capital investment from them. So it happened a little faster here, but it can happen much faster today.
So you're calling a sweatshop a stepping stone?
Yeah, it's the first rung on the ladder of economic development. And some people have this idea of a race to the bottom, and they make it sound like these factories go in and then the price of labor gets too high and they run, and you think that it's like been raped and pillaged. But what really happened, right? Think about Hong Kong. So it became a textile sweatshop producer in the 1960s. Wages and productivity rose. As that productivity rose, these workers were valuable doing things other than stitching garments. The factories couldn't afford to hire these workers away from their better alternatives. As that became the case, they moved offshore and went to other places that had poor workers who the best use of their labor was stitching garments. Hong Kong, of course, is as wealthy as the United States today. It's an inspiring place for those of us who understand freedom to visit and to see the development that is there. But the sweatshops, as they left, is because the people climbed the economic ladder, and it was no longer economical to have sweatshops there.
Yeah, they outgrew them.
Yeah, exactly.
It's funny you should mention the 1960s. Even on Long Island, where I grew up, my grandma was widowed. She lived with us out in the leafy suburbs. One of the last sweatshops factories on Long Island was not far from our house. She used to go sew sleeves on blouses to make a little extra pin money to go shopping. I don't remember her being upset about that. It was great for her to get out and do a little work.
Absolutely. Other great free market economist, Milton Friedman, he said that his mother worked in a sweatshop when they arrived in the United States in the 1910s and 19-teens, and that while the pay was low compared to today's standards, she viewed it as a step up. And I think that's true of other people who have done this.
So, Ben, broadening out from sweatshops, you've made even more of a pariah of yourself by coming out against laws banning child labor. Shouldn't every young child be in school? I mean, how could someone be so cruel and heartless to ask them to work just to buy cheaper socks and undershirts?
It might be better for them to be in school than to work, but it's better for them to work than to starve to death. And unfortunately, that's the situation that many of these children face. Children work because their parents are poor and are struggling to feed and shelter the family. When families escape extreme poverty, child labor rates plummet. But if we just ban products from child labor or pass laws against child labor, that doesn't all of a sudden make that family richer. All it did was take away their least bad option for keeping their family alive. So there was an instance in the early 1990s when Senator Tom Harkin proposed banning imports from Bangladesh because of child labor. It never became law, but in response, the factories fired thousands of child employees. Oxfam, the British charity, investigated and found that many of them became prostitutes or starved.
Jeez.
Clearly worse alternatives than working in a factory. Now, those are extreme examples, but when we look around the world to the countries that have sweatshops in them and examine what sectors children work in, manufacturing employs a teeny percent of the children who work. Most children who work in agriculture or household services. In both those industries, the pay is much lower than it is in the factories, and in the case of agriculture, rates of child injuries are higher. We in the first world, though, only interact, for the most part, with the manufactured products that can come from those countries to ours. So when we feel bad about benefiting from child labor, what we do is we take away the sector that children work in where their options are the best. And we push more of them into household services and agriculture where they build fewer skills, have less pay, and have sometimes greater risk of injury. The best cure for child labor is the process of growth. There was a wonderful study of child labor in Vietnam throughout the 1990s. What they found, as families hit income levels where they could afford, I think, about a 1,900 calorie per day diet for each family member, child labor rates plummeted. Then right again around the official poverty line, again, child labor rates plummeted. And that's how we cured child labor here in the United States. We, of course, have laws against child labor now, but when we didn't, when we were as poor as Bangladesh or Vietnam, the first national child labor law passed in the United States doesn't come about till 1938.
Really?
By that point, our average income in the United States in today's dollars is between $10,000 and $11,000 per capita. But if you look around the world today and look at rates of child labor, when you hit $11,000 per capita, there is virtually no child labor in a country. It's really only under that about $2,500 per capita limit that you see about a third of children working. Then it drops way off after that to under 10% and eventually down to 0% by about $10,000 to $11,000 per capita. That means we passed a law against child labor once the market process had pretty much grown us out of having child labor anyway. Now, there were some state laws beforehand. My home state of Massachusetts was the nation's first, I believe, in 1842. But here's what the law said. Children under 12 can't work more than 10 hours per day in a factory.
Really?
This was a restriction that wasn't a restriction at all. First of all, if you're 13, go ahead and work.
Yeah.
And if you're 12 and under, you're limited to a 60-hour work week, basically, 10 hours Monday through Saturday.
And this was the American path.
This is the American path. So what happened, the economists who have studied the adoption of various child labor laws and mandatory school attendance laws, what they find is once you control for economic growth, these laws had very little effect. What they basically did was codify stuff that was happening already because of the process of development.
So what's the best thing we can do to improve the lives of sweatshop workers around the world?
Unfortunately, these countries often have poor institutions that don't promote growth. I know of no way to export our economic freedoms, rule of law, and property rights to countries that don't have them that isn't very problematic and likely to fail. So that's what they need to grow at home. But there's an obvious alternative. if we really care about a poor Haitian garment worker, we don't care about the development of Haiti. We care about the development of the Haitian. And if you offer him admittance to the United States, overnight, the very same worker with no change in their skills, a Haitian moving from Haiti to the United States, their income goes up by about 1,000%. And it's because they're better able to use their human capital to interact with others here in the United States, where they can be more productive.
Well, now you're really scaring the unions to death.
Yes, possibly. But if we're talking about how to help third world workers, that would be the number one way to do it. And actually, I should say, though, for the record about the scaring the unions of this, with other studies I've worked on immigration, and a lot of the research on this really says that the impact of immigrants coming to the United States has virtually no effect on the number of jobs available to the native born. It just changes the mix. And as for wages, the effect is almost exclusively on high school dropouts, and even then it's small, between 0 and -8%, and temporary, as in goes away after a few years.
So what can the individual conscientious shopper do if he cares about this issue?
The best thing an individual conscientious shopper can do is buy products made in the third world. It increases the demand for their labor and ultimately helps them earn higher wages there.
So, Ben, what's the overall punchline?
Listen, sweatshops are bad compared to the conditions we have here, but they're the best available realistic alternative in the short run for the people who are in them. The upside is, for these countries that aren't improving their institutions, these sweatshops are like a crutch that's the worker's least bad option. For those that do embrace economic freedoms and property rights, it's just a stage in the process of development, and the good news is you can move through that stage much faster than you could in the past, and that's the pathway toward prosperity and first world standards of living for these people.
Ben, thanks for sharing that with us, and thanks for being on the show.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That was Ben Powell, Director and Professor of Economics at Texas Tech, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Please stop by realclearradio.org or check out our channel on YouTube to stay up to date on our podcasts. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.